So good afternoon, I'm Shriya Pal Chaudhary. I'm from the Rohini Nilekani Center for Brain and Mind, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here today. Today's discussion is themed around the future of mental health policy and framework. And this is the first of hopefully many events that we organize, both by the Center for Brain and Mind in collaboration with the Infosys Science Foundation. And we are thankful for the support of the Rohini Nilekani Philanthropies as well as the Infosys Science Foundation in making this event possible today. Want to take a few seconds to talk about BATE, which is our outreach initiative from the Center for Brain and Mind. And we've envisioned this space as a space for conversations about mental health to ease the societal taboo that we face in talking about mental health problems, disorders, both at the community level as well as in terms of policy and framework, but always backed by scientific evidence. And this is one of the events that you see in our endeavor to do this. I'd like to invite on stage Professor Raghu Padanjat to talk to you about what the Center for Brain and Mind is and what our missions are. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the event today. So I guess all of us know somebody who suffers from a mental illness. It might be a friend, a family member, somebody in the surroundings. But at a more impersonal level, there are also national statistics and international statistics that depersonalize the issue, but they tell us that this is a very large problem. And it's a very large problem where there is a paucity of solutions. In the area of mental illness and well-being, there are a few problems, clinical problems that need a solution. First of all, we struggle with the idea of who is it that will fall ill, who's the person that is susceptible to falling ill with a mental illness, and that is an unresolved issue. There are many challenges surrounding the diagnosis of mental illness, separating them out or not. And of course, there's a well-known challenge of how do you treat mental illness? What's the best way to do it? Who will respond to treatment and who will not? And predictions on that will greatly aid both clinicians and patients going forward. Now, there's of course a very long history of trying to address this problem. It's not for lack of trying. But unfortunately, despite many, many years of work, it has not been possible to make huge progress in this area. There's, of course, been substantial progress in understanding how the brain is built and how it functions. And there's also been insights into what goes wrong in patients who are ill with a mental disorder. But nonetheless, it remains a problem. And one of the issues has been that while we have been very good at working on problems related to the brain as an organ, at an individual level of analysis, be it behavioral or physiological or cellular or molecular, it's been much more challenging to bridge the gap between these different levels of function. And probably that is something that is necessary to make a significant dent on this problem. So some 10 years ago, colleagues from NCPS with our many friends in NIMHANS and at the time INSTEM, decided that we would try and build a program that would seek to bridge the gaps between these various scales of analysis. And that's the historical origin of the Center for Brain and Mind. What we did was to try and curate a patient cohort that would capture the essential features of some of the most common mental illnesses. And then we designed a study that would run for many years to build a natural history of the illness as a function of time and across scales of brain function, and make this available as a discovery platform. This is a discovery platform that is available not only to investigators in the program, but it is designed as a platform from which anybody in the world should be able to use the information and data and ask questions related to any of the domains of mental illness that I mentioned earlier. So this discovery platform has been building this has been going on for the last 10 years or so. We started in 2015 and we are in 2026 now. And this will continue for the next many years. The natural history of these illnesses is about 20 plus years. And to build a natural history, we need that much of time. And this is one of the main activities of the Center for Brain and Mind. In addition to this, the Center for Brain and Mind also promotes conversations and interactions that are designed to bridge the gap between the lab and the clinic, and between the clinic and the patient community and other stakeholders who have interests and in the area of mental illness. And today's event is part of one such activity, which Shreya mentioned. And we hope to have several such events in the future that will help facilitate this dialogue, but also bring to the wider attention of all stakeholders the availability of the Discovery platform and using it for finding solutions for the problems of human mental illness. So I'll stop there. Thank you, and we look forward to Vikram's talk.
Thank you, Raghu. With that, I'd like to introduce the host of today's afternoon, Professor Prabha Chandra. Professor Chandra is a senior professor of psychiatry and former dean of behavioral sciences at NIMHANS, Bangalore. She's a clinician, teacher, and researcher, and her work on women's mental health has received international recognition. Her research focuses on reproductive psychiatry as well as the interface of biology and the social determinants of women's mental health. She has been the president of the International Association of Women's Mental Health and is the editor-in-chief of the Archives of Women's Mental Health. She has served as a temporary advisor to the WHO and the UN AIDS and is a fellow of the National Academy of Medical Sciences, India, fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, UK, and fellow of the Royal College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists, UK. With that, Professor Chandra, please take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Shreya, and thank you, Raghu, for setting the tone of today's evening discussion. It gives me great pleasure to introduce a good friend and collaborator and a mentor of sorts, Professor Vikram Patel. So there is the Wikipedia version of introductions, and there is a more personal way of introducing people. I'm going to choose the latter because everybody knows Vikram. And so it was the year 1996 when a wide-eyed 32-year-old young person came to Goa to set up something new. He had a dream. And you can imagine 1996 mental health was really not talked about as much in India as it is today. And he was just 32. He had finished his medicine from GS Seth Medical College in Mumbai, got a Rhodes Scholarship, went to Oxford, did his MSc there, and of course his training in psychiatry. Then he did his PhD in Zimbabwe with a study in Harare, and came back to Goa to set up something which is considered a model for public mental health in the world today, and a Center for Global Mental Health. And this was something that, was possible through to being very futuristic, looking into the future at a very, very young age. And I'm sure he would have, been taken by any university anywhere in the world, but he chose to do something more close to his heart and developed and has mentored numerous young researchers. It's probably one of the few not-for-profit organizations or NGOs which actually has had, I don't know how many PhD scholars, and collaborating with major institutions across the world, getting funding from major institutions. In fact, they're celebrating their 30th year this year. The few other things about Vikram are that he is, of course, he's the Paul Farmer Professor of Global Health and Social Medicine at the Harvard Medical School, Paul Farmer being one of his close mentors and friends. And for those of you who want to read about his relationship with Paul Farmer, he's written a beautiful obituary about him in the Indian Journal of Medical Ethics. Vikram is a prolific writer. I think he has been the lead author for more than, at least last count, 10 Lancet commissions. And his most recent one, which we hope we will talk about, is very relevant to India. It is the Lancet Citizen Commission, which lays a roadmap for health in India. And I think that's something that we would like to brainstorm with him a little bit. For Vikram, personal is political. And all his writing is rooted in his personal experience. So if you read about the experience his mother had with the health systems and the siloed care, and then he discusses that and then takes it over to what actual good care should be for the elderly, and makes recommendations. He was very, very brave in writing an editorial in the Lancet called "The Death Foretold," about the cut in fundings which happened recently in the US, and discussing how it was almost like a bereavement response that he had. So I think for him, science and public mental health is something that is rooted in his being. He's, of course, everybody will say that he was part of the Time 2015 most influential list, and I think that's mentioned in every introduction, which is by itself commendable. I remember when I called him and to congratulate him, he said, "Oh, but Prabha, even Kim Kardashian is there in the list." So, but he failed to mention that Malala was in that list, that Satya Nadella was in that list, and no other than PM Modi was in that list. So Vikram, there is a reason to be proud. He recently spoke at the Jaipur Lit Festival about citizen-led mental health in India. And I think this is a very opportune movement for us in India. While we're talking about Viksit Bharat, where the world is now moving from global to national because of the way things are happening around the world, a time for us to reflect on what mental health should look like for us in India and the future of mental health. So over to you, Vikram. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Prabha. That was a really wonderful personal introduction. And so actually what I am going to do is I am going to actually present to you what for me is, it's a new lecture that I have been preparing. Apart from this is actually the first time I'm really giving it. I have a couple of other big public lectures I'm giving over the next 7 months in Melbourne, in Amsterdam, and in St. Louis. And it's really thinking, as I come to what I consider maybe the last phase of my own career, what have I learned over the last 30 years? What have I seen and heard from my colleagues and the people I admire and people who have said very important things about what I consider the most baffling of all human health experiences? And what I want to share with you today is really two very important things. First of all, I want to be quite provocative and ask the question, why is it that almost all our efforts over the last 5 decades to understand human mental health, and especially mental illness, have really led to a cul-de-sac? And I'll speak more about that. And yet, I will also argue that over these last 5 decades, there have been very important new learnings, new knowledge, come from very different disciplines of science and social sciences as well, which actually can offer us a completely different way of reimagining mental health. But when you see my title, you will see that I allude to the fact that that new way actually is a way that existed more than 50 years ago. And that's why I actually, cheekily title my talk is Back to the Future. But let me start by really quoting a dear friend of mine, Thomas Insel. Tom, I know that this is a slightly mixed group. There are people here who may not be mental health researchers or practitioners. So some of my remarks I'm going to try and break down for that particular group who are sitting here today. So Tom Insel is one of the most prominent biologically minded psychiatrists of our generation. He was the director of the National Institute for Mental Health, which is the world's largest funding body for mental health. And most of the money, more than $20 billion during his particular leadership, goes to understanding the basic fundamental biology of the brain as it might be related to mental health. And I don't need to read out what's on this slide, but it's a pretty despondent statement. In spite of all the money that's been spent, every metric of mental health has gotten worse in America. And on this slide, you can see one example of that metric. What you see here is a flat line. This is showing you the prevalence of mental illness in the United States in the most recent period that I have data for. And what you can see is absolutely no change across all the different age groups. But if you look at the blue line, which is young Americans, you actually see that the scale of the y-axis is compressed. But if I had to expand it, what you would see is that, in fact, the prevalence in young Americans has actually gone up by nearly 25% in the last 15 to 20 years. Prevalence of mental illness is often a very abstract idea for most policymakers, but dying and dead bodies are not. And in fact, the United States has seen this most dramatic crisis, I call it a catastrophe actually, since the year 2000, of the dramatic increases in deaths in middle-aged Americans being driven by behavioral factors, primarily suicide and substance use, both alcohol as well as opioids. In fact, more Americans have died of behavioral factors in the last 2 decades than the total number of Americans who've died in war, and God knows America has fought many wars since 1940. So it's an incredible catastrophe, and it's entirely related to poor mental health. Now, in the United States, many of my colleagues often think it's because we don't have enough people like me, psychiatrists, psychologists, and other mental health professionals. But actually, that is not the case when you compare the United States to the rest of the world. On this slide, what I've constructed is simply showing you the number of one particular category of mental health professionals, psychiatrists, to the population. And you see the most populous countries in the world. And in a nutshell, the United States has more mental health professionals per capita than any other country on the planet. In fact, the United States spends more money on mental health care than on any other health condition, including cancer, which comes often as a surprise to most American psychiatrists and psychologists. Often, just to shock my U.S. colleagues, I often, come up with the incredible figure that there are more psychologists and psychiatrists in New York City than in the whole continent of Africa. There are more psychiatrists trained in India who are now working in the United States than there are psychiatrists in India. So this gives you a sense that a country as well-resourced in mental health professionals and is spending so much money on mental health care has seen and also spent so much on science in mental health, has absolutely failed in bending the arc. Now, you might wonder, is this the same situation for other health conditions? Not quite. So for example, on this slide, I show you a slide which may come across as a little abstract for the non-scientists in this room. But essentially what this is showing you, the blue line at the bottom is showing you the burden of depression in the world over the last 30-odd years. And the red line is showing you the burden of heart disease, heart attacks. Ischemic heart disease for the medical people in this room. And what you can see is a very clear figure that actually in almost every other area of human science, human medical science, we have seen miraculous discoveries. And I often think of, cancer as perhaps the best example of them all. When I was a medical student, the diagnosis of cancer was one of the most demoralizing diagnoses. Today, actually, the vast majority of people with cancer can look forward to a life free of the disease or live with the disease for a long period of life. On the other hand, you can see with mental illness, the most common of them is depression. We see absolutely no impact at all. So friends, we have to confront the proverbial elephant in the room. Why is it that we have utterly failed to change the course of population mental health, when at the same time we have seen transformations in every other area of medicine? Now, many others before me have hypothesized on this very important question. And what I'm going to do is just summarize what I think, what they and what I believe is the reason. And it's quite simply the reason that about 50 years ago, there was a dramatic change in the way we began to conceive of mental illness. And what began to be a dominant paradigm was one that had worked very well in other branches of medicine. And that was to view mental health through the narrow biomedical prism of diagnostic categories. And what this did was, it divided the world into two groups, people with a disorder and those without. And within the group of people with a disorder, we then invented multiple more categories that supposedly differentiated between different kinds of mental disorders. This paradigm was adopted in a very well-intentioned way because it had worked really well for other branches of medicine. But the singular difference for other branches of medicine was this, that those paradigms were based on understandings of the mechanisms that led to those different diagnoses. However, in the case of mental illness, we knew absolutely nothing about the mechanisms. So what the architects of these classifications, the first one that actually did this particular form of classification on the left was in the early 1970s, the third edition of the American Diagnostic Manual, and then later on the World Health Organization's 10th edition. What the architects of these systems did is that we knew nothing about what caused any condition. So how would we define these categories? Here's an interesting historical footnote. They brought together a group of psychiatrists, mostly psychiatrists, which first of all is also an important point to make. They brought them into a room, and who were these psychiatrists? They were all white men working in essentially highly stratified tertiary psychiatric university hospitals, and asked them to sit in a room and figure out what might be the diagnostic categories that we should use in psychiatry. And what did they do? They obviously used what they saw in their clinics as the way to distinguish different groups. I'm obviously simplifying a very complex story, but that in essence is what happened. And on that basis, we came up with the diagnostic system. Now you can quickly see that such a project was doomed from the outset for two important reasons. First of all, the 99.9% of the world's population was actually not included in those observations. Who gets to a tertiary university hospital in America? You can do the math yourself. It is a minuscule, non-represented fraction of how mental health really looks in the population. So what we were seeing is diagnostic categories based on a group of people who don't actually represent the vast majority of others in the population they come from. And secondly, of course, the world itself was absent from those classifications. This was almost entirely based on what was seen in American and British clinics. The other interesting point was that actually the designers of these classification systems never intended for them to be used as clinical manuals. They were actually intended to be research tools. And the idea was that if we organize people into these different diagnostic boxes and then we research those people, we might ultimately discover something about the mechanisms of those conditions. Unfortunately, what happened was that these rapidly became clinical manuals. It became the dominant way that psychiatrists and psychologists today actually think of these as natural human conditions as opposed to research categories that deserved to be tested, and if they didn't quite work, to reject them. Consider the result of what we are observing today. It is, what is the basis of a classification? There are two fundamental things that make a classification of natural things be valid. The first is that if you fall in the same category, like two peas, you must share at least some basic characteristics with each other. But equally, if you're a pea, you should have clear daylight between yourself and an apple. There has to be some fundamental difference between two diagnostic categories if these were truly hewn in nature. This is unfortunately completely not the case with any mental health diagnostic category. In the case of depression, for example, it is perfectly possible for two people to have the diagnosis of depression and share not a single symptom in common. And most diagnostic categories in mental illness are so blurred in their boundaries that it is perfectly possible for the same individual to have multiple diagnoses at the same time. You're failing the basic test of what is a true diagnosis. Indeed, we now know that a vast body of science, clinical science, epidemiological science, but even genetic science, the most fundamental science of all, show that what we are seeing in so-called diagnostic categories are not true in nature. This particular paper, which was published in the world's leading science journal, Nature, led by some of my colleagues at Harvard Medical School and a very large consortium of people, examined a very simple question. Do different psychiatric conditions based on diagnostic categories actually show distinct genetic signatures? They put together the largest body of data ever done in this kind of research, 1 million individuals with any one of these 14 diagnostic categories and 5 million people without, and using a set of very complicated genetic analyses, came up with a startling conclusion that it was impossible to differentiate the genetic signatures of almost any of these conditions from one another. So friends, the core obstacle, I argue, in the mental health crisis that we are facing around the world requires us to interrogate these basic assumptions that have been at the heart of the science of mental health and indeed, therefore, the practice of mental health care. And at the heart of this is the narrow biomedical classification of mental disorders. What this has done is that it has privileged binary diagnostic categories rather than the full spectrum of mental health experiences that each of us experience, not only in our daily lives, but in certain circumstances become mentally ill. It's privileged a very narrow view of what produces and shapes our mental health down to only our brains, completely ignoring or largely ignoring the fact that our social worlds are in a constant interplay with our brains. It has focused largely on adults instead of, as I will show you in a moment, the overwhelming evidence that actually most mental health conditions have their seeds in early childhood. It's focused on treatment because this is what psychiatrists do very well, rather than on prevention, which typically lies outside the medical sector. And it's focused on what matters to us clinicians rather than what matters to people. The failure of this foundational framework is very evident today. After over half a century and literally scores of billions of dollars spent on science, we don't know the cause of any one of these mental disorders that exist in our diagnostic manuals. And unsurprisingly, we have no cures for any of these conditions. In fact, I will argue that the very idea of a cure is problematic. Because the idea of a cure comes from infectious diseases. And in fact, the idea of diagnoses comes from infectious diseases. And let's pause for a moment and think about what an infectious disease is. An infectious disease is the invasion of our bodies by something external. And the notion of a cure is that you eliminate that invader from our body. I argue that fundamental idea of a cure is inappropriate for mental illness. Because in the case of mental illness, what we're talking about is a fundamental human experience that is part and parcel of who we are, and we can never, ever fully cure ourselves of that experience. Instead of discoveries and cures, what this approach has done is in fact to fuel the othering. Inadvertently, by the way. I don't for a moment seek to criticize the architects of the system, because if I was in their shoes in the 1970s, I would have done probably the same thing. But I'm going to suggest to you what we should do now, a little later in my lecture. Instead of discoveries and cures, what this approach has done has to fuel the othering of people struggling with mental health problems. It's promoted a paternalistic attitude that they are biologically somehow defective from the rest of us and need chemicals to fix them. And this, of course, has inadvertently stoked the fires of stigma and discrimination, which makes the suffering worse. Now, let me clarify for a moment. Some of my colleagues feel that I may be alluding to the fact either that mental illnesses do not exist or that I am an anti-psychiatrist. I'm neither. In fact, as a psychiatrist, I'm very proud to be a psychiatrist who has worked in the clinics of on four different continents. I can tell you from my observation that there is not a shred of doubt in my mind that mental illnesses exist, that they're universal forms of human suffering. My critique is not about the existence of mental illness. My critique is not even about their biological underpinnings. My critique is about the way for the last 5 decades we've framed our science and our practice of mental illness. So I'm now going to go into what I believe are the strands that help us think about mental illness in completely novel ways. And to do this, I'm going to dip into work that I myself have been deeply engaged with the last 15 to 20 years, but also work that I've been very inspired by colleagues. And I'm going to refer to these in interchangeable ways. And so these 5 different strands of science begin, first of all, by recognizing, most importantly, that our minds have a very deep evolutionary origin. I want to draw, when I talk about our minds, primarily on our fundamental emotions. These are, of course, things you cannot observe. At least so far, we cannot observe empirically. Our emotions are our raw feelings. These are our primary basic feelings. Examples: joy, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, lust, and disgust. These are just some of our primary emotions. What I want to argue is that these are not only universal human experiences, not only are they deeply wired in our biology, but most importantly, that they are also deeply related to our evolutionary heritage. In fact, these emotions have served a profoundly important adaptive function, and they can be traced back to our most distant animal ancestors. And the first person to actually, document this was none other than the father of evolutionary biology, Charles Darwin himself. I quote him, "Animals like man manifestly feel pleasure and pain, happiness and misery." How many of you in this room have a pet? Yeah, I can assure you that this strikes a chord. When you see this, anyone who owns a pet will say, I know my pet feels a whole range of emotions. I can't ask the pet what they feel because we don't have the language for those emotions. But there is no doubt in my mind through the behaviors that I see in my pet that they have emotions. And in fact, most animal models of mental health infer emotions by actually modeling the behaviors that are associated with them. The only time I can think of when a Nobel Prize in medicine and physiology, which historically has only been ever given for very basic scientific discoveries made in the laboratory, the only time I can think of when a Nobel Prize was actually given for a behavioral science scholars was in 1973, when these animal behaviorists, who are of course at the heart of actually demonstrating the fundamental animal origins of our emotions, won the Nobel Prize. Over the last couple of decades, I've been fortunate to work with many evolutionary biologists, and through their work, I have learned a lot about which emotional experiences, and particularly their brain bases, can be traced back to ancestry, and it is staggering. This slide shows the evolutionary map of phenomena that we associate with depression. And you think, okay, you can trace these raw primary emotions back maybe to our primate cousins, chimpanzees, for example. But it turns out you can trace these back to zebrafish. You can trace these back to reptilian ancestors. The core circuits in our brain, for example, for those of you who are neuroscientists, the circuit that connects the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex and thalamus, which are deeply connected with the emotion of fear, you can trace these circuits back to our reptilian ancestors several millennia ago. These circuits still remain intact several millennia later in the human brain. What has changed, of course, in the human brain is our size, and especially the size of the section of the brain immediately behind our forehead. Now, why is this important? This is important because it tells us that these emotional states have an adaptive function. And through animal behavioral research, we know what those functions are. Those adaptive functions are to ensure our survival, and in part, that survival is through our reproductive success. Fear and anxiety is the best exemplar of that survival. If we did not feel fear, we would land up in such serious danger, our survival would almost certainly be threatened. And the best example of that fear, which is deep-rooted in our brain, is the fear that we have for deadly, threatening events like fire or poisonous animals. But interestingly enough, even low mood, the social withdrawal that you see when you are feeling depressed, also has a survival mechanism. It actually helps protect you from further loss and further threat. On the other hand, of course, the very responses, these emotions that have been hardwired in our brains over millennia to protect us, can in fact become pathological. They become pathological when the challenges we are facing in our daily lives no longer match, from an evolutionary perspective, what has evolved to protect us. Consider, for example, workplace stress. This very human experience that all of us take for granted is about 100 years old. There was no workplace stress before that. Our brains that have evolved over millennia are suddenly having to adapt to workplace stress, which is chronic, unrelenting. There are many other such kind of stresses that never existed before. And in the context of these new social environments, I argue, this is when these emotional reactions and their attendant behaviors can in fact become pathological. My final point on this particular very important evolutionary principle is that this is the reason why humans have from times immemorial, right from the most primitive human societies, developed techniques to help calm our emotions. The two techniques that have stood the test of time across millennia again are the techniques of meditation, various kinds of techniques to calm our minds, which we now technically call regulatory techniques, and, of course, the use of psychoactive and psychedelic substances. Let me turn to the second strand of science, and this is something that I personally have been very deeply invested in, and that's the role of early life. I'm going to draw this all together, by the way. That's the role of early life in shaping our brains and therefore shaping our minds. Actually, the first time that I recall in my readings that the importance of early life was actually written about was when this guy, who looks very grumpy and angry, but actually he is one of the most important scientists in the field of the mind. Many of you will not recognize him because he's been somewhat consigned to the dustbin of history. But actually, I consider him, his observations from more than 100 years ago in Vienna, probably the equivalent in the field of the science of the mind to that of Newton in the field of understanding the earth. Of course, this is Sigmund Freud. What is this observation that he made that I'm referring to? He made this incredibly startling observation in Vienna back at the turn of the 19th century, that he was seeing these adults in his clinic who were appearing with the most baffling physical symptoms. They could suddenly lost their voice, they suddenly lost the ability to move a part of their body, they were having weird convulsions and fits. And he was actually trained as a neurologist, and he could find nothing in there, at least to the extent you understood neurology then, he could find little or nothing that could really pinpoint an organic lesion in the brain. So he started taking their histories, and he discovered that all of these individuals had histories of great trauma in their early childhood. These were very particular kinds of trauma, particularly related to sexual trauma. Nevertheless, there were traumatic incidents, and because we knew so little about the brain then, he arrived at a theory he made up about the repression of these early life traumas and how they would then occur or reappear in later life in the context of new stressors. He came up with the theory, of course, of psychodynamic explanations for these observations. Now, that theory has not stood the test of time, but his observation has. And that observation is best explained. In fact, the proof of that observation comes on this slide, which is a slide that simply tells us a very important question. When do mental health conditions emerge? Most of us who are clinicians who are working in clinics around the world, think they emerge in our mid-30s. Actually, what this slide shows you is roughly 2/3 of all mental health conditions occur before you hit your 20s. This is a startling finding, because what it tells you is that mental health problems are developmental problems. They actually occur before your brain is fully shaped. We now know, of course, that our brain is not fully shaped until your mid-20s. In other words, mental health problems are part and parcel of the developmental process of your brain. And we also now know the mechanisms through which these problems emerge. The mechanisms are critically related to two phases in our early childhood. Well, in our early years, rather. The first is in the first 10 years of life. And during those 10 years of life, we know that the brain is in a state of constant change. And what is shaping the brain is, in fact, the environment that the child finds herself or himself in. And this is why the physiological effort needed to build a healthy brain increases with age. And this is why James Lackman, the economist of all people who won a Nobel Prize in economics, argued that the best investment for public policy to create a healthy, productive, and educated workforce was actually the first few years in life. And as you invested later and later in life, the return on your investment grew lesser. Policy lesson for India: we should have invested in preschools and primary schools before the IITs. Instead, we took exactly the opposite route and built world-class engineering schools before we built world-class primary schools. The second critical stage in life is around puberty and the years immediately after. The brain is still plastic then. It's still, of course, it's plastic right through our life course. I often think, the best example of that I teach my students is, ask yourself the question. Some of us must know people who've had strokes. This is a condition that hits you in your 70s or in later life. And one of the most crippling features of a stroke is losing your speech. What do you do when you lose your speech? You don't take a pill. You go to a speech therapist. And ask yourself a question. How in heaven's name does the speech therapist help you regain your speech? That is proof of brain plasticity all the way, even up into the last years of your life. However, the fact remains, the brain is most plastic, most responsive to the environment in the early years of life. What happens in adolescence, though, is something slightly different. In adolescence, all the way into young adulthood, you see a different developmental process. And that is a fascinating one. What you see on this slide is the deep part of the brain that I showed you is intact in our reptile ancestors. It's called the limbic cortex. It's the part of our brains that actually mediate our raw emotions, what I call the basic primary emotions. Lust. Think lust. Very important when you're 13 years old. Think rage. Very important when you're 14 years old. These emotions that are mediated by the limbic cortex, this part of our brain matures around puberty. The brakes, as it were, that make you stop and think, that's just behind our foreheads. This part of the brain matures in the early 20s. So you have a fully 8 to 9 year period of life when, as it were, your limbic cortex is driving your decision making without the necessary breaks of judgment and higher order thinking that occurs during later adolescence and early adulthood. So these two very important neurodevelopmental changes. By the way, this part about adolescence, we've only really understood well in the last 30 years, thanks to novel neuroimaging techniques that have only become available in these last 30 years. But one guy understood this much, much better than any neuroscientist did. And that guy was Walt Disney. You only have to actually see any Disney movie, and you will invariably find an adolescent character, usually an animal adolescent character, who behaves impulsively, does not listen to the adults, does exactly the opposite of what they are told to do, because this is how we're wired. We are wired to explore the world as adolescents in order to be able to learn how to deal with the world when we become independent adults. Think of, Simba the lion in The Lion King. Think of Nemo in Finding Nemo, and you will find plenty of examples that Walt Disney understood what it meant to be an adolescent better than any neuroscientist did. My third strand is about the science of epidemiology, which tells us about the environments that shape our brains. In the previous science, I described the life course stage in which our brains are shaped. This form of science tells us about the environments that shape our brains. And in this form of science, I want to really hit on work that I have been very deeply involved with, really examining how poverty is a very powerful driver of poor mental health. And in this slide from our work that was published in the journal Science, we examine the various mechanisms and we demonstrate that actually the relationship between disadvantage and poverty is actually bidirectional with mental health. And I want to now connect this finding with developmental science. The single most important form of disadvantage that is associated with poor mental health is adversities in early childhood. So you can see the link here. Growing up in poverty is by far the most common form of disadvantage. And early childhood is the time when your brain is most plastic. Therefore, it should come as no surprise to us today that the single most common risk factor for poor mental health across our life course is not what is happening to us today. It's what happened to us when we were kids. That's not to say that today doesn't matter. It's just that the most powerful drivers are when we were kids. And this is why this particular form of vulnerability is what I consider the tobacco of mental health. It's equivalent to the tobacco. It's been shown time and again across every population and across every kind of mental health or behavioral condition to be the most powerful risk factor for poor brain and mind outcomes. And we know good reasons why. Growing up in poverty can insult your brain directly, for example, because children who grew up in poverty grew up in more polluted or toxic environments, or because you don't have enough of the essential nutrients that are important for your brain. However, a much more invisible and more pernicious factor that is associated with poor developmental outcomes is just neglect. Now, not for a moment am I suggesting that parents who are poor are neglectful. What I'm suggesting is parents who are living in poverty find it extremely hard to provide the essential nurturing environments that their newborn children and their young children need for the brain to develop healthily. And my colleagues in the Center of the Developing Child at Harvard have produced some wonderful online public engagement materials. I'd encourage you to go to their website. There's some beautiful videos that they've developed to demonstrate two different pathways through which neglectful environments can actually impair the architecture, the actual physical connections in the brain, as well as how these different parts of the brain speak to one another, the circuitry of the brain. One is through simply lack of stimulation. Our brains need to be constantly stimulated as children for them to develop healthily. For example, someone I met today told me that bilingualism, for example, is a protective factor for neurodegeneration. Yes, that's a good reason why, because when you're bilingual, you're actually stimulating various parts of your brain. But the second very important feature of neglectful environments is when you have stress, which is unrelenting. Stress is very common. It's part of everyday life. It's not the problem. It's when the stress is unrelenting, your brain is bathed in a soup of toxic chemicals and hormones that actually impair the architecture of the brain. A few years ago, actually a decade ago, I began to ask the question, I can understand if poverty is bad for your mental health, but what about other more abstract social pressures on your lives? For example, as we all find ourselves today living in a world that is increasingly disconnected, more and more unequal, I was fortunate that in the US, a very large study called the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development Study was actually public and open access, a very important call for making all our science open access. This is an incredible resource of more than 8,000 children who have been followed up over many years, who have been not only examined clinically for their mental health, but also had very deep analyses of their brains through a variety of different brain-based assessments, including sophisticated neuroimaging methods. So along with my postdoc, we asked a very simple question. What does it feel like what is the experience on your brains of growing up in different states of the United States? Because the US, of course, like India, is a federal country, and every state is like a country in itself in terms of a variety of social connection measures. And we asked the question, does growing up as a child in a more unequal American state affect your brains? After adjusting for obviously thousands of things that can also affect your brain development. And moreover, over time, do those architectural and functional changes in your brain affect mental health? It seemed like a real long shot, to be quite honest, because inequality is such an abstract economic concept. But to my complete surprise, and this paper was just published a few months ago, we not only found clear relationships between the level of inequality in the American state in which these kids lived, which is measured by something called the Gini coefficient, and both metrics of brain volume but also brain function. But incredibly, at the same time, a parallel group in Europe was harnessing a similar data set, and their paper is actually preprint right now, and not only found exactly the same that we found, but in fact even found the same brain regions that are affected mostly in the prefrontal cortex, again, the part of the brain behind our foreheads. And you might ask, what kind of social stressors are creating that toxic stress that is impairing brain function? There's a rich psychological and sociological literature that speaks to that occurring as a consequence of social disconnection from one another, but also the social comparison, which is also an extremely important source of stress. And if social connection and social comparison are going to affect the human brain, particularly in adolescence, by something as abstract as inequality, which is so distal from our daily lives, friends, and we should really think very carefully about what social media is possibly doing to the developing brains of adolescents. I strongly believe, as I've written in an editorial in the Indian Express today, that actually what is happening in Australia is perhaps the most important public policy legislation taken by any country to put their children's lives before that of the corporate profits of the social media and tech industry. For me, the science is very clear. The science comes from developmental science, that adolescents are primed because of their developmental nature to compare themselves with their peers. Adolescents are primed to take risks. This is part of who we are as a human species. And what the social media companies have done is actually mastered the ability to literally hijack the reward circuits of adolescents and keep them hooked onto social media. This, by the way, is why we do not allow adolescents to smoke or to drink, because we know this from neurobiology. Social media hijacks the same neural circuits as tobacco and alcohol does, and India cannot afford to allow this corporate hijacking of our young people's minds to continue. By the way, Australia is not the only country. More than a dozen European countries are preparing legislation to pass the onus for age verification on to the social media company rather than to the parent. The fourth piece of science comes from the work that my colleagues in Sangat have been doing, which is really examining how simple techniques that are largely restorative in nature or target the internal and social worlds can actually help people who are struggling with their mental health actually recover some of their well-being. This particular kind of work has been now transformative in the field of mental health. Prabha alluded to this earlier. More than 100 randomized controlled trials. This is now, of course, clinical science, designing brief interventions that are based on psychological science that are really seeking to correct some of the maladaptive emotional responses. Again, I'm trying to draw together what I described right at the beginning, arguing that many of our mental health distressing experiences are maladaptive expressions of actually evolutionary properties of the human organism. And bringing that into play and asking the question, how can we actually use this knowledge to help people who are struggling with their mental health recover? And this kind of technique has been, I organize these techniques into 3 broad buckets. Techniques that help people promote emotional regulation. Think of meditation, think of prayer, think of mindfulness. These are a range of different techniques that really act primarily on the prefrontal cortex to help calm a kind of tumultuous brain. The second acts at much deeper, at the limbic level, which is essentially stopping you from avoidance behaviors, because it recognizes that avoidance behaviors, while adaptive when there is a mammoth outside your cave, is not going to help you with workplace stress. And so reducing avoidance behaviors, and of course a third is addressing social factors like, for example, relationships with your spouse. My colleagues in Sangat and I have been working for the last 2 decades, and now there are more than 20 randomized controlled trials that they have actually, that my colleagues and I have been developing different brief techniques. Most importantly, can be delivered by frontline workers. And one of those techniques is the one that I'm going to show you a brief video in a moment, is targeting people who are suffering from persistent depressive symptoms. It's a technique that is based on very well-established animal behavioral theory, tested multiple times with humans, and it's, of course, deeply grounded in evolutionary thinking, which is about reversing avoidance behaviors that are typically seen with people who are facing extreme stress. And it's simply a technique that gets people to recognize the link between the avoidance and the perpetuation of their depression, and how re-engaging with socially rewarding cues can actually help reverse those avoidance techniques. And here is a video that demonstrates what it might look like in the real world.
खूप त्रास आहे 2 वर्ष झाली तकली तुका आणि चक्कर येल्यासारखीच डेली तकली तुका डेली घरातले कसले काम जायना जाय भिजून रावा दीस भुरग्यांक सुद्दां लागी घेयना जाय कितेंच घरातले करिना जाय
म्हाका खूब त्रास करता घरा देव आनी तेजी बायलूय शिकयता आनी म्हाका खूब टेंशन जाता तकली आनी हांव बरें नासता म्हाका जेवपाची बीन याद उरना आनी कितें खावचें कितें काम करचें अशें म्हाका दिसत ना आनी भुरग्यांकूय हांव केन्नाच सारकें वाडिनाशिल्लें कांय करिनाशिल्लें तांकां एक कितें करप आनी कितें घातलें आनी घालप आनी टायमूच म्हाका असो बसोनूच हांवें काडप म्हाका खूब टेंशन जाता.
With depression, we've developed a very specific treatment called the Healthy Activity Program. This is a treatment that's based on the concept that when people become depressed, they stop doing activities that they typically do. For example, there may be social withdrawal, they may not be able to keep up with their work demands, they may stop doing pleasurable activities like watching TV, reading, etc. The less they do, the worse they're likely to feel. So the Healthy Activity Program is delivered over about 6 to 8 sessions. So the main focus of the initial sessions is to get patients to become activated, to start doing things that we know will help them feel better.
कितें काम कर म्हणजे मागीर थंय रोंपो लायलो मातशें अशें भोंवंक वचूंक लागलें जावं काटयां हाडूंक लागलें शेतान मातशें वचूंक लागलें आनी कितें भाजी पालो घरा कडेन रोवंक लागलें आनी तितून मागीर म्हाका म्हयन्यान करून म्हाका एक 9 म्हयन्यांनी सारकें पूर्ण तकली म्हाजी शांत बरी जाली. पयलीं तेणी 5 मिनटां कुळागरां वचून काम कर म्हणलें मागीर तेणी म्हाका 10 मिनटां दिलीं मागीर 15 मिनटां दिलीं मागीर म्हाका तें काम बरें जाता अशें दिसलें हांवें 5 मिनटां 2 मिनटां वाडोवन करप मागीर म्हाजी भुरगीं येतालीं मदत करून आनी इतल्यान म्हाजें आतां कुळकार निव्वळ आसा आनी म्हाजें कामच चालू बरीं जाता आनी म्हाका आतां वखद सुद्दां नाका बरी जाली तितूंतल्यान आनी बरी आसा हांव सामकी.
आनी आतां म्हाका खूब बरें दिसता. जशी तकली जास्त दुखना, केन्ना अशी चुकोन दुखता. बेगीन उठपाचें, भुरग्यांक शाळेक धाडपाचें जाता, त्रास जायना. तकली बी दुखना आदल्या सारकी.
This particular intervention has now been adapted and evaluated in more than half a dozen countries around the world, and I'm most thrilled to say that this treatment is now actually being delivered in the United States and Canada, probably making a very unique example of an Indian innovation that actually is being implemented in some of the world's richest countries. And then the final piece is that to do with the lived reality of mental illness. I have been very deeply influenced. This is a kind of, it is a form of knowledge. It may not be a traditional form of science, but it is, in fact, equally important as a form of knowledge. And I've been very deeply influenced by essentially the movements of people who live with mental health problems. Some of them choose to describe this as psychosocial disability, and I think it's an interesting use of words because they focus, therefore, not on the biology, but actually on the social experience of living with a mental illness. And of course, as we all know, disability is a social construction. But if you see on this slide, which tries to demonstrate the mismatch between the biomedical perspective that actually focuses on things like symptoms and biochemical imbalance in the brain, and what people with mental health conditions prioritize, in this case, in the case of depression, which is functional and vocational recovery, understanding and addressing contextual stressors, and restoring agency and social connection. This is the fifth and final body of knowledge. So 5 propositions to end my talk on, which emerge from these very different forms of mental health science. First, that our emotional experiences are not our pathology. They are universal, primal elements of our being, and they have deep, important roles in our well-being, in our survival, in our adaptation. It is environments in our early lives, particularly up until our mid-20s, that are critically important for shaping our brains. And during these early years of life, social disadvantage is a very powerful driver of mental health through very different mechanisms. Brief interventions that can be delivered by frontline workers targeting both our inner worlds as well as our immediate social worlds are very effective to promote recovery, and indeed the lived experience of people with mental health problems often prioritize these very same worlds. Friends, the attempt to classify us into diagnostic categories is doomed because our mental health, our minds are shaped by such a unique set of factors. I often think of our genes as the frame of the painting of our lives, but only the frame. The actual painting of our lives is painted, especially during the first 2 decades of our lives. The confluence of what the genes we're born with the early life experiences that we have, and of course our contemporary life experiences, make each of our life stories so very unique that each of us, as it were, is a unique specimen when it comes to mental health. And this is why clubbing us into these categories has so spectacularly failed to actually discover anything unique or specific about a mental diagnosis, because they don't really exist in the same way as we think they do. Of course, the best proof of this is just looking at twin studies. Identical twins who grew up in the same neighborhood, who grew up with the same parents, still land up with very different mental health trajectories. I kind of think of the diagnostic approach, and I think, it was very well intentioned. It was, as I mentioned, we did not really know much about mental illness then. We still don't know much about it now. But what I would like to position those is as a hypothesis. As a scientist, I would have positioned that as a hypothesis. And if I followed the spirit of science, then I would argue that hypotheses are intended to be tested and ultimately either proven or rejected. And I would argue, if after 50 years and countless billions of dollars of science trying to test this hypothesis, if we have still not discovered anything dramatic, then it's time to reject the hypothesis. In those years, however, so many other new forms of science have taught us so much about what shapes our minds and our brains. And therefore, what I argue is it's time to turn the clock back. Turn the clock back to the time when DSM-3 and ICD dominated and took over our fields, and examine where we were then and take off from there. And when we do that, actually, we find a number of really exciting starting points for us to embed the new science. The first is the theory that explains our minds that's been around for 50 years. This theory goes back to the 1960s. It's called the stress diathesis theory. What it simply tells you is what I've spent 45 minutes trying to tell you, which is that all of us have some vulnerabilities that are hardwired. They're biological vulnerabilities. Partly they are to do with our genes, and partly they're to do with how our early lives shape our brains. And in the context of those vulnerabilities, depending on the extent of those vulnerabilities and the extent of the stresses we are facing in our contemporary adult lives, either we will develop a mental health condition or we won't. That is a simple hypothesis or theory that I think actually ties most of this together. Another very important piece, again, which I'm trawling out of the history books, is the notion of simply asking people what matters to them. My dear colleague, Arthur Kleinman, who is one of the world's great medical anthropologists, someone whose work has profoundly influenced me and now is one of my faculty at Harvard Medical School, wrote some of the most classic texts back in the 70s, where he argued that the way to best achieve a good mental health outcome is to actually have a narrative with the individual about what matters to them, what their lives might look like. And in the clinical world, and Prabha will remember when we trained as psychiatrists way back a long time ago in the 80s, this is exactly what we did. We were taught to do what was called a clinical formulation. Not what we do today, which is take a cookbook and do a checklist and say, you have this diagnosis, and then we're going to blindly follow some guideline, presuming that everybody with this diagnosis needs exactly the same cookbook recipe. Instead, what we used to do when we were psychiatry residents, where we were taught to look at the entirety of a person through the prism of their narrative, their life story, what we called a clinical formulation. What we also can now embrace is the notion that mental illness doesn't suddenly begin like a switch. Today you have one, tomorrow you don't. In fact, we all have different stages of mental health experiences. And that means that we do not need to wait to reach some arbitrary diagnostic threshold before we can trigger care. But the most exciting thing of all is that that care, as science has shown, some of the most path-breaking science from the least resourced parts of the world, can be delivered in communities by other people in that community, most of whom have never been to college, leave aside even going to a medical school or a school of psychology. And this, of course, opens up the tantalizing prospect that we can actually translate from neural circuits to communities. This is a kind of an interdisciplinary framework that I'm most excited about, that in a way, it bypasses the complete huge roadblock or the elephant in the room of these diagnostic categories and frees us to really examining how the brain looks, behaves, and is shaped, and finding ways and techniques that we can help people in their own communities. I want to end with this slide, which I love because it's a quote that I love to use, which is really about what person-centeredness should look like. The person who wrote this is saying that implementing people-centered care, she wrote this in the context of chronic conditions like diabetes, but of course, many mental health problems, sadly, can also be chronic conditions. Implementing people-centered care in the era of chronic conditions requires a fundamental shift away from what is the matter with you to what matters to you. What patients want is not rocket science, which is really unfortunate, because if it were rocket science, we would be very good at it, particularly here in Bangalore. We love rocket science. What we're not so good at are the things that are so simple and basic that we overlook them. Thank you very much.